Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of Arizona's Navajo Nation, places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these vast desert landscapes, mesas, and tribal police jurisdictions are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts, each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. The Navajo Nation Police Department serves a territory of over 27,000 square miles, an area larger than 10 U.S. states combined. Within this expansive jurisdiction, officers have documented encounters that defy conventional explanation. These 7 cases represent some of the most disturbing incidents from the region known locally as the Devil's Zone, an area where ancient beliefs and modern law enforcement intersect in ways that challenge our understanding of reality. The Navajo people have long spoken of entities that walk between worlds, and tribal police officers often find themselves at the boundary of these intersecting realities. What follows are their testimonies, their official reports, and the lingering questions that remain. These are not legends passed down through generations, but contemporary encounters documented by sworn officers of the law. Now, let us begin with our first story. It was late November of 2013 when Officer Michael B. Gay began his shift at the Navajo Nation Police Department's Tuba City District. The desert air had grown crisp as winter approached the high plateau, and the setting sun painted the sandstone formations in hues of orange and purple. B. Gay had served with the tribal police for 7 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. He knew these roads like the lines on his own hands, every wash, every turn, every landmark that rose from the earth like ancient sentinels. His patrol that evening would take him along Highway 160 through the remote stretch between Tuba City and Kayenta, a lonely 50-mile corridor where cell service faded in and out like a dying radio signal. The Begay family had a long history of service to the Navajo Nation. Michael's father had been one of the first tribal police officers in the 1970s, helping to establish law enforcement on the reservation during a time of transition and change. His grandfather had served as a Navajo code talker during World War II, returning home to become a respected community leader who helped bridge traditional Navajo ways with the modern world. Michael had grown up hearing stories from both men, tales of desert rescues, of tracking lost hikers in the canyons, and of encounters that defied easy explanation. These stories had instilled in him a deep respect for both the natural world and the mysteries that sometimes emerged from its vast expanses. The desert night descended quickly, as it always does in Arizona, transforming the landscape into an expanse of darkness punctuated only by his headlights and the infinite canopy of stars above. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, and B. Gay could see his breath in the crisp air as he exited the station for his patrol. The winter sky was exceptionally clear that evening, with the Milky Way stretching across the horizon in a brilliant display that never failed to humble him, no matter how many times he witnessed it. He checked his equipment methodically: flashlight, radio, first aid kit, and the emergency supplies that could mean the difference between life and death if he found himself stranded in the remote desert. Around 9:47 p.m., as he approached the mile marker 326, his headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road, a young woman in traditional Navajo dress, her dark hair blowing in the evening breeze. Begay slowed his vehicle, noting that she was standing near an area where no residences existed for miles in any direction. The nearest community was over 15 miles to the east, and there were no turnoffs or side roads in this section of Highway 160. The woman stood perfectly still, as if she had been waiting for him, her posture suggesting neither urgency nor distress, but rather a patient certainty that he would stop. When he pulled over, the woman approached his passenger window, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark, expressive eyes that seemed to hold an unusual depth. "I need a ride to the junction at 191, she said in Navajo, her voice barely above a whisper. "My car broke down back there." Her dialect was formal, almost archaic, with inflections that Begay associated more with his grandmother's generation than with someone who appeared to be in her early 20s. There was something about her presence that felt both familiar and strangely out of place in the modern world of patrol cars and highway systems. Begay radioed dispatch to inform them of the passenger, then unlocked the door. "Picking up a female passenger at mile marker 326, he said into the radio. "We'll be transporting to Highway 191 Junction." The dispatcher acknowledged with a routine acknowledgement, unaware that this would be no ordinary transport. The woman slid into the passenger seat, bringing with her a scent like rain on dry earth, peculiar given that no precipitation had fallen in weeks. The fragrance was subtle but distinct, a combination of sage, damp soil, and something else that Begay couldn't quite identify but that reminded him of the air after a summer thunderstorm. She wore a velvet dress adorned with silver conchos, the traditional attire of a Navajo woman, though Begay found it odd that someone would be dressed so formally on such a cold evening. The dress appeared to be handmade, with intricate stitching that spoke of considerable skill and attention to detail. Her moccasins were also traditional, made of soft leather with decorative beadwork that caught the light from the dashboard. Her hair was long and dark, falling past her shoulders in a style that suggested she had not recently adopted modern hairstyles or cosmetics. Everything about her appearance seemed to belong to another time, another era of Navajo life. As they drove, the officer attempted to make conversation, but the woman responded only in brief, cryptic phrases. "Are you from around here?" he asked, trying to establish some context for her situation. "I belong to this place," she replied, her gaze fixed on the road ahead rather than on him. "Did you call anyone about your car breaking down?" he continued. "No one would have come anyway," she answered, her voice maintaining the same quiet, measured tone. The temperature inside the vehicle seemed to drop inexplicably, causing Begay to reach for the heater control, though he had just adjusted it moments before. When he glanced over at his passenger, he noticed something unsettling. Her reflection in the passenger window appeared distorted, as if viewed through water. The image seemed to ripple and shift, though the woman herself remained perfectly still. Begay blinked, thinking it might be a trick of the light or a distortion in the glass, but the phenomenon persisted. He could see her clearly when he looked directly at her, but her reflection remained wavering and indistinct, like a heat mirage on a summer road. This subtle impossibility began to work on his nerves, though he couldn't quite articulate why it disturbed him so profoundly. 20 minutes into the journey, as they approached the turnoff to Highway 191, the woman spoke again. "You should turn here," she said, pointing to a dirt road that led into the darkness rather than the well-lit highway junction. The road she indicated was little more than a two-track that disappeared into the desert, a route Begay knew led to an abandoned uranium mining site that had been closed for decades. "That's not the way to 191, Begay replied, confused. "The junction is just ahead, where the lights are." The woman repeated her instruction with more urgency, her voice now carrying an edge that made the hair on the officer's arms stand up. "You must turn here. It's important." When he refused, turning instead toward the highway, a strange phenomenon occurred. The radio began emitting a series of clicking sounds, though it had been set to a silent frequency. The clicking was rhythmic and deliberate, like a communication in Morse code, though Begay couldn't decipher any pattern in the sequence. The interior lights of the patrol car flickered momentarily, and the engine seemed to lose power for a fraction of a second before resuming its normal operation. Begay looked down to check the equipment, and when he glanced back up, the passenger seat was empty. The door remained closed, the seatbelt still fastened across where the woman had been sitting moments before. Begay immediately pulled over, conducting a thorough search of his vehicle and the surrounding area with his flashlight. There were no footprints in the sand beside the road, no indication that anyone had exited the vehicle. The door handle was cold to the touch, and the seatbelt had somehow become unfastened and lay neatly across the empty seat. He checked the back seat, the trunk, even under the vehicle. Nothing. The desert around him was silent and empty, with no sign of movement in any direction. The radio had returned to normal operation, as if the strange clicking had never occurred. The only evidence that he had ever had a passenger was the lingering scent of rain on dry earth that still hung in the air. Shaken, the officer called dispatch to report the bizarre incident. "Dispatch, this is Officer Begay," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I need to report an unusual situation. The female passenger I picked up at 3:26 has disappeared from my vehicle." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before the dispatcher responded. The dispatcher, who had been with the department for over 2 decades, listened patiently before responding. "You picked up the girl at 3:26, didn't you?" When Begay confirmed, the dispatcher told him that this was the 3rd such report in as many years, a young Navajo woman in traditional dress who would disappear from vehicles along that same stretch of highway. The official incident report, filed as case number 13011-287, notes the unexplained disappearance and includes a detailed description of the passenger, though no matching person has ever been identified. Begay spent over an hour at the scene, documenting every detail he could remember about the encounter. He noted the woman's appearance, her formal traditional dress, her archaic dialect, the strange scent that accompanied her, the distorted reflection in the window, and the bizarre radio malfunction. He even attempted to recreate the seatbelt configuration, trying to understand how it could have been unfastened and arranged so neatly across the empty seat without any visible means of egress from the moving vehicle. The following day, Begay returned to the area during daylight hours, searching for any evidence that might explain the previous night's events. He found nothing: no houses, no broken-down vehicles, no sign that anyone had been there. The dirt road the woman had wanted him to take led, as he knew, to the abandoned mining site, a place that local residents avoided due to contamination concerns and stories of strange occurrences. He walked the area around mile marker 326, examining the desert floor for any tracks or disturbances that might provide clues, but the wind had erased any traces that might have been left the night before. What he did discover, however, was a small roadside memorial that he had never noticed before, a collection of flowers, coins, and other offerings placed around a simple wooden cross. The memorial was weathered and old, suggesting it had been there for many years, with fresh additions that indicated people still visited regularly. The offerings included traditional items, turquoise beads, corn pollen, and small bundles of sage, alongside more modern tokens like coins and photographs. Someone had recently placed a string of white prayer flags around the cross, their edges fluttering in the desert breeze. When he asked an elder from a nearby community about the memorial, he learned that it marked the spot where a young Navajo woman had died in a car accident nearly 30 years earlier. According to local tradition, she had been on her way to a ceremonial gathering when her vehicle had stalled on that remote stretch of highway. The elder, a woman named Martha who remembered the incident clearly, told Begay that the young woman's name had been Lorraine Tsosi, and she had been known for her beauty and her dedication to traditional Navajo ways. She was wearing her finest velvet dress that night, Martha explained, because she was going to sing at the ceremony. She had a voice like an angel, they say. Official records confirm that a 23-year-old woman named Lorraine Tsosi had died there on November 14, 1983, after being struck by another vehicle while waiting for assistance. The accident report described how her car had stalled on the highway during a cold November night, much like the one Begay had experienced. Another driver, who had been drinking, had swerved onto the shoulder and struck her vehicle from behind. Lorraine had been standing outside her car, trying to flag down help, and was killed instantly. The other driver had fled the scene and was never identified, leaving the family without justice or closure. The incident report filed by Officer Begay remains active in the cold case files of the Navajo Nation Police Department, a silent testament to the night when the boundary between the living and the dead seemed to dissolve in the Arizona desert. In the years that followed, Begay would occasionally drive past that stretch of highway, always glancing toward the spot where he had picked up his mysterious passenger. The roadside memorial continued to be maintained, with fresh appearing regularly, though he never saw anyone actually visiting or tending to it. Other officers reported similar encounters over the years, though none were as clear or as detailed as Begay's experience. The story became part of the department's unofficial lore, a cautionary tale told among new recruits and veteran officers alike. Some dismissed it as a hallucination or a case of mistaken identity, but those who knew Begay respected his professionalism and his connection to traditional Navajo beliefs. He never spoke publicly about the incident, but in private conversations with trusted colleagues, he acknowledged that what he had experienced that night had profoundly affected his understanding of the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. The Navajo concept of ghostly encounters is complex and deeply rooted in cultural traditions. According to these beliefs, spirits sometimes remain attached to places of strong emotional significance, particularly where their lives were cut short. These spirits are not necessarily malevolent, but may seek to complete unfinished business or to communicate with the living. The traditional Navajo way of dealing with such encounters involves specific ceremonies and protocols designed to help the spirit move on and to protect the living from potential harm. The roadside memorial at mile marker 326 serves both as a remembrance of Lorraine Tsosi and as a way of honoring her spirit according to traditional customs. For Michael Begay, the encounter became a turning point in his career and his personal spiritual journey. He began to study more deeply the traditional teachings of his people, seeking guidance from elders who could help him understand what he had experienced. He learned that the desert he patrolled every night was filled with stories and presences that existed beyond the realm of ordinary perception. His work as a police officer took on new dimensions, as he came to see it not just as enforcing laws, but also as maintaining balance between the seen and unseen worlds that coexisted in the vast landscapes of the Navajo Nation. The incident report remains in the cold case files, officially unresolved and unexplained. Periodically, a new officer or investigator will review the file, searching for logical explanations or overlooked details. But each examination ends with the same conclusion. There is no conventional explanation for what Officer Michael Begay experienced on that cold November night. The story has become part of the larger tapestry of unexplained phenomena that occur in the remote expanses of the American Southwest, where ancient traditions and modern realities intersect in ways that challenge our understanding of the natural world. Today, the memorial at mile marker 326 still stands, a small gathering of offerings and prayers that marks the boundary between two worlds. Drivers passing by might notice it briefly, if at all, unaware of the mysterious encounters that have occurred there over the decades. For Michael Begay, who still patrols those same desert highways, the memory of that night remains vivid, a reminder that there are mysteries in this world that defy explanation, phenomena that exist in the space between what we know and what we can only imagine. The desert night continues to unfold its secrets to those who travel its lonely roads, sometimes revealing glimpses of other realities that exist just beyond the edge of our perception. In early March of 2015, officers Thomas Yazzie and Robert Chi were dispatched to a remote residence in the Crystal Chapter area of the Navajo Nation. The call had come in at 2:13 a.m. from an elderly woman who reported hearing strange noises outside her home and seeing a figure moving unnaturally across her property. The night was moonless, with only the distant light pollution from Page, Arizona, visible on the horizon. As they drove the unpaved road that led to the caller's home, both officers noted the unusual silence that had fallen over the desert. Even the coyotes, whose calls typically punctuated the night, were conspicuously absent. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees, and a thin layer of frost coated the sparse vegetation that dotted the landscape. Officer Thomas Yazzie had been with the Navajo Nation Police for 12 years, having grown up in the nearby community of Kayenta. He knew these desert roads like the lines on his own hands, having traveled them since childhood. His partner, Robert Chi, was newer to the force but had lived in the Crystal Chapter area his entire life, giving him an intimate knowledge of the land and its people. Both men had heard stories of strange occurrences in this region, but as trained law enforcement officers, they approached each call with professional skepticism. The dispatcher's voice had carried an unusual urgency when she relayed the call, noting that Alice Nez was not one to make frivolous reports. This detail alone was enough to heighten their awareness as they navigated the winding dirt road that led to the isolated homestead. The landscape around them was a study in shadows and subtle textures. The juniper trees stood like silent sentinels against the starlit sky, their twisted forms creating patterns that seemed to shift and change in the peripheral vision. The desert floor, typically alive with the scurrying of nocturnal creatures, was unnervingly still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath that night, carrying only the distant hum of transmission lines from the Page power plant, a constant reminder of the modern world that existed just beyond the boundaries of the reservation. As they drove deeper into the desert, the beams of their headlights cut through the darkness, revealing frost-covered sagebrush and the occasional jackrabbit that froze momentarily before disappearing into the night. The caller, 78-year-old Alice Nez, was waiting on her porch with a flashlight when the officers arrived. She appeared frightened but composed, her traditional moccasins wrapped in a blanket against the cold. "It's been coming around for 3 nights now," she explained in Navajo, with Yazi translating for Chi. "At first, I thought it was a coyote, but tonight I saw it clearly. It walks on 2 legs like a man, but hunched over like an animal. Its eyes, they glow red in the dark." Nez pointed toward the western edge of her property, where a row of juniper trees marked the boundary with open desert. "It went that way, toward the mesa." Yazi noted that Nez was a respected elder in the community, not prone to exaggeration or fantasy, which made her report particularly concerning. Alice Nez had lived in this remote homestead for over 50 years, having moved there with her late husband shortly after their marriage. Her small stone house, built by hand from materials gathered from the surrounding land, stood as a testament to traditional Navajo building methods. Despite her age, Nez maintained her property with fierce independence, chopping her own firewood and tending to the small flock of sheep that grazed on the nearby pasture. Her reputation in the community was that of a woman of great wisdom and practicality, someone who had seen much in her lifetime but was not given to flights of fancy. When she spoke, people listened, which is why her call to dispatch had been taken with such seriousness. As Nez led the officers around her property, she pointed out where she had first heard the strange noises 3 nights earlier. "It started as a scratching sound," she explained, "like something trying to get into the sheep pen. But when I went out with my flashlight, there was nothing there. The sheep were agitated, huddled together in the far corner of the pen." The second night, she had heard what sounded like heavy footsteps circling her home, but again, when she investigated, she found nothing. It was only tonight, when she had seen the creature with her own eyes, that she had finally called for help. "I've lived out here my whole life," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes, "and I've never seen anything like it. This was not an animal I know." As the officers began their investigation, Yazi noticed several unusual tracks in the sandy soil near the fence line. They appeared to be footprints, but with a strange, elongated shape and a depth that suggested something much heavier than a human had made them. The prints led from the desert toward Nez's home, then circled the property several times before retreating back toward the mesa. Chi, who had grown up in the area and was familiar with local wildlife, could not identify the tracks as belonging to any animal known to inhabit the region. "Whatever made these," he said quietly, "it was walking on 2 legs." The officers followed the tracks with flashlights for approximately 200 yards before they simply ended, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. The forensic detail of the tracks was puzzling to both officers. Each print measured approximately 16 inches in length, with a width of 8 inches at the widest point. The depth of the impressions suggested a weight of at least 300 pounds, distributed in a way that was inconsistent with human footfalls. What was most unusual was the spacing between the prints, approximately 7 feet apart, indicating an impossibly long stride. The toes of the prints showed what appeared to be 3 distinct digits, each ending in a sharp point that suggested claws rather than nails. Yazi carefully photographed each print, noting the direction of travel and the absence of any drag marks or heel impressions that might have helped identify the creature responsible. Chi, who had hunted deer and elk in these mountains since he was a boy, could not match the tracks to any animal he had ever encountered. "A bear's print is wider, with 5 toes," he explained to Yazzie, "and a mountain lion's shows retractable claws. These tracks don't match either." Even more puzzling was the fact that the tracks seemed to appear out of nowhere, with no approach path visible in the sandy soil. It was as if the creature had simply materialized at the edge of Nez's property, begun its circular patrol of her homestead, and then vanished just as mysteriously. The officers marked each print with evidence flags, creating a visual map of the creature's movements that seemed to defy all logical explanation. At approximately 3:27 a.m., as the officers were documenting the tracks with a camera, they heard a sound from the direction of the mesa, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. Both men trained their flashlights toward the sound, catching a brief glimpse of a figure moving among the rocks at the base of the mesa. What they saw defied easy explanation. Something tall and gaunt, covered in what appeared to be dark fur, moving with an unnatural gait that was neither fully human nor entirely animal. The figure turned toward them, and for a moment 2 points of red light were visible in the darkness, eyes that seemed to glow with an internal luminescence. Yazzie radioed dispatch to report their sighting, but the transmission was met with only static, despite their location normally having clear reception. The sound that had drawn their attention was unlike anything either officer had heard before. It began as a high-pitched whine, like metal scraping against rock, but then shifted into a complex series of tones that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The acoustics of the desert canyon should have carried the sound clearly, but instead it seemed to surround them, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact location of its source. When they finally caught sight of the creature, the beam of Yazzie's flashlight revealed a figure that stood at least 7 feet tall, with long, thin limbs that moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. The dark fur that covered its body seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making it difficult to discern clear details of its form. What remained etched in both officers' memories were the eyes, not the reflective glow of an animal caught in a flashlight beam, but a deep, internal red luminescence that seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own. There was an intelligence in those eyes that was more terrifying than any animal's predatory gaze. When the creature turned toward them, both officers felt a primal fear that transcended their training and experience. Yazzie's attempt to contact dispatch was instinctive, a procedural response to an unprecedented situation, but the static that answered his call only deepened the sense of isolation and vulnerability that had suddenly enveloped them. The encounter lasted no more than 10 seconds before the figure vaulted onto a lower ledge of the mesa and disappeared from view. The officers approached the area where it had been standing, finding more of the strange tracks, but again, they ended abruptly at the base of the rock wall. There was no evidence of climbing, no handholds, no disturbed rocks, no indication of how the creature had ascended the nearly vertical surface. By this time, additional officers had been dispatched to assist, including Sergeant Benally, who arrived with a K9 unit. The police dog, normally aggressive in unfamiliar situations, refused to approach the area where the tracks ended, whining and pulling back on its leash despite the handler's commands. The movement of the creature as it escaped defied the laws of physics as the officers understood them. The leap onto the mesa ledge covered a horizontal distance of at least 15 feet and a vertical rise of 8 feet, accomplished with what appeared to be minimal effort. There was no running start, no crouching to gather momentum, simply a fluid, impossible motion that carried the creature from the desert floor to the rock face in a single bound. When the officers reached the base of the mesa, they found the same mysterious termination of tracks that they had observed earlier. The footprints simply ended at the vertical rock wall, with no indication of how the creature had ascended. Sergeant Benally arrived at approximately 3:45 a.m., accompanied by Officer Martinez and his K9 partner, Rex. The German Shepherd, typically fearless in the face of potentially dangerous situations, displayed an uncharacteristic reluctance to approach the area where the tracks ended. Despite Martinez's commands, Rex flattened his ears, tucked his tail between his legs, and whined pitifully. This behavior was particularly unsettling to the officers, as police dogs are trained to remain calm and focused in even the most stressful situations. Bean Ali, a 20-year veteran of the force, examined the evidence with a practiced eye, but even he could not explain what his officers had encountered. "I've seen a lot of strange things out here," he admitted quietly, "but nothing like this." The following morning, a search party was organized to explore the mesa, but no further evidence was found. The official incident report, filed as case number 15-03092, describes unidentified footprints and a visual sighting of an unknown bipedal entity approximately 7 to 8 feet in height. The report also notes the unexplained radio interference and the unusual behavior of the police K-9. In the weeks that followed, several other residents in the Crystal Chapter area reported similar sightings, though none were as clear or as close as that experienced by Yazzie and Chi. The case remains officially unsolved, though many in the community believe the officers encountered a skinwalker, a malevolent witch from Navajo tradition who can transform into animal form and move with supernatural abilities. Both officers have since declined to speak publicly about the incident, citing department policy, but privately, they have acknowledged that what they saw that night defies any conventional explanation. The mesa where the figure disappeared continues to be avoided by local residents after dark, a silent testament to the strange events of that cold March night. The search party that convened the following morning consisted of 6 officers, including Yazzie and Chi, as well as 3 volunteers from the community. Armed with climbing equipment and extensive knowledge of the local terrain, they systematically explored the mesa where the creature had disappeared. Despite their thorough investigation, no additional tracks were found beyond the point where the initial prints had terminated. No hair, no scat, no disturbed vegetation, nothing that might provide further evidence of what the officers had encountered. The rock face itself offered no clues, with no handholds or footholds that might explain how the creature had ascended the vertical surface. In the days following the incident, word spread quickly through the Crystal Chapter community. While some were skeptical, others came forward with their own accounts of strange occurrences in the area. A rancher living 5 miles from Nez's homestead reported that several of his sheep had been found mutilated in a manner inconsistent with predator attacks. Another family described hearing unusual sounds outside their home on the same night that Yazzie and Chi had their encounter. Perhaps most troubling was the report from a young couple who claimed to have seen a similar figure crossing the road near their home the following week. These accounts, while not as detailed as the officers' experience, suggested that what had been witnessed was not an isolated incident. The concept of skinwalkers, or Yi-Naldlushi in the Navajo language, is deeply rooted in traditional Navajo beliefs. According to these teachings, a skinwalker is a type of witch who has attained the highest level of priesthood in a particular sect of witchcraft. These individuals are said to possess the ability to transform into animals, to read human minds, and to cause illness and death. The transformation is accomplished by wearing the skin of the animal they wish to become, allowing them to take on not only the form, but also the abilities of that creature. Traditional Navajo people rarely speak openly about skinwalkers, believing that to do so might invite their attention or incur their wrath. For the Navajo Nation Police, cases involving potential skinwalker sightings present unique challenges. On one hand, officers are trained to gather evidence and follow procedures based on scientific principles. On the other hand, they are members of a community where traditional beliefs hold significant sway. This duality creates a delicate balance that must be maintained in both the investigation and the documentation of such incidents. In the case of Officer Yazzie and Chi's encounter, the official report carefully avoided any reference to skinwalkers or supernatural explanations, focusing instead on the physical evidence and the officer's direct observations. The psychological impact on the officers involved in such incidents cannot be overstated. Both Yazzie and Chi underwent mandatory counseling following the event, as is standard procedure for officers involved in traumatic situations. In private conversations with their supervisor, both admitted that the experience had shaken them in a way that no previous encounter had. I've faced down armed suspects, responded to violent domestic disputes, and handled accident scenes that would make most people sick, Yazzie confided to Sergeant Benally weeks later. But I've never felt the kind of primal fear I felt looking at those red eyes in the darkness. Chi, who had always been particularly proud of his knowledge of the natural world, struggled with the fact that he had witnessed something that existed outside his understanding of the natural order. In the months that followed, both officers requested transfers to different districts. While the official reason given was career advancement, those close to them knew that the March incident had played a significant role in their decision to leave the Crystal Chapter area. Neither officer would speak publicly about what they had witnessed, adhering strictly to department policy and the cultural taboo against discussing skinwalkers. In private, however, both men acknowledged that their experience had fundamentally changed their perspective on the world and the mysteries it contains. The mesa where the creature disappeared continues to cast a long shadow over the Crystal Chapter community. Local residents now avoid the area after dark, and even during daylight hours, few venture near the base of the rock formation where the tracks had ended. Alice Nez, whose call had initiated the strange encounter, installed additional security measures around her home, including motion-activated lights and a more substantial fence for her sheep. She never reported any further incidents, but when asked about the events of that March night, she would simply shake her head and say, "Some things are better left alone." The official case file remains open in the cold case archives of the Navajo Nation Police Department, categorized as unexplained phenomena. Periodically, a new officer or investigator will review the file, searching for clues that might have been missed, but each examination ends with the same conclusion. There is no conventional explanation for what officers Yazzie and Chi encountered on that cold March night. The photographs of the tracks, the audio recording of the strange sounds, and the detailed reports from all involved officers create a compelling documentation of something that defies categorization. For those who live in the Crystal Chapter area, the incident has become part of the local lore, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones around fires and in the quiet hours of the night. Some believe it was indeed a skinwalker, while others suggest it might have been a bear suffering from a disease that altered its behavior. A few even speculate about extraterrestrial connections, pointing to the red eyes and impossible movements as evidence of something not of this world. What everyone agrees upon, however, is that what happened that night was real. A tangible encounter with something that exists beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The desert night in the Crystal Chapter area has returned to its normal rhythms, with the coyotes once again punctuating the darkness with their calls and the nocturnal creatures resuming their activities under the vast canopy of stars. But for those who were there, for Alice Nez, for officers Yazzie and Chi, for Sergeant Benally and the others who responded that night, something has permanently shifted. They have looked into the red eyes of the unknown and have been forced to acknowledge that there are mysteries in this world that defy explanation, phenomena that exist in the space between what we know and what we can only imagine. The mesa stands silent now, holding its secrets within the ancient rock, a silent testament to the strange events of that cold March night when the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed to dissolve in the darkness of the Navajo desert. It was late September of 2017 when officers Daniel Bedoni and Frank Nakai began their evening patrol in the Kayenta district of the Navajo Nation. The monsoon season had officially ended, leaving behind clear skies and cooler temperatures that made night patrol more bearable. Both men were experienced officers with over a decade of combined service in tribal law enforcement. They had worked together as partners for nearly 2 years, developing an easy rapport and an intuitive understanding of each other's methods. Their route that night would take them through the remote northeastern section of the district, an area characterized by rugged canyons and sparse population, a region where calls for service were infrequent but often complex when they did occur. At approximately 11:15 p.m., the officers received a dispatch call regarding a possible domestic disturbance at a residence near the edge of the district, close to the Arizona-Utah border. The location was particularly isolated, requiring a 45-minute drive on unpaved roads that wound through a series of shallow canyons. As they proceeded toward the call, both officers noted the unusual clarity of the night sky. The Milky Way was visible in stunning detail, with stars so bright they cast faint shadows on the desert floor. The radio communication became increasingly intermittent as they traveled deeper into the canyon system, eventually fading to static altogether. This was not unexpected, as the topography of the area was known to disrupt radio signals, but both men made a mental note of the time, 11:52 p.m., knowing they would need to check in again once they reached higher ground. The next thing either officer could clearly recall was standing outside their vehicle approximately 3 hours later, with the engine still running but the headlights pointed at a canyon wall rather than the road. Both men were disoriented, experiencing a shared sense of confusion that was immediately alarming. Their watches showed 2:58 a.m., though neither could account for the missing 3 hours. The dispatch call they had been responding to had apparently been resolved by other units, as there was no record of them ever arriving at the scene. A thorough inspection of their vehicle revealed no damage and no signs of struggle, but the GPS system had been disabled, and the dashboard camera had somehow been powered down during the period they couldn't account for. The only unusual detail was a thin layer of reddish dust covering the hood and windshield. Fine particulate that didn't match the soil composition of any area they had traveled through that night. When the officers returned to the station, they underwent mandatory drug and alcohol testing, both of which came back negative. A departmental investigation was initiated, as the unexplained gap in duty time was a serious matter. Both men underwent separate interviews, during which they recounted similar experiences of disorientation and memory loss. Bedoni described a dreamlike memory of standing in a circular formation of tall, indistinct figures, while Nakai recalled an impression of being examined or studied by an unseen presence. Neither officer could provide concrete details, and both expressed frustration at their inability to account for 3 hours of their shift. The department's Vehicle Maintenance Division conducted a thorough inspection of the patrol car, finding no mechanical or electrical malfunctions that could explain the disabled equipment. The most puzzling evidence emerged during a forensic analysis of the reddish dust found on the vehicle. Laboratory testing revealed that the material contained elements not typically found in Arizona soil, specifically higher concentrations of iron oxide and trace amounts of minerals that were more consistent with Martian soil samples than with terrestrial geology. This bizarre finding was documented in the official investigation report but remained unexplained. Additionally, when the GPS data was eventually recovered, it showed that the vehicle had traveled approximately 12 miles off-road into an area of the canyon system that was inaccessible by conventional vehicles, a fact that contradicted the pristine condition of the undercarriage and tires. Both officers were placed on administrative leave pending a psychological evaluation, which found them fit for duty but noted symptoms consistent with a shared dissociative episode. They returned to active duty 3 weeks later, but neither was willing to discuss the incident with colleagues. The official case file, numbered 1709-241, remains open with the notation "Unexplained time loss and equipment malfunction." In private conversations years later, both men have acknowledged that something happened to them that night that defies conventional explanation. "We weren't alone out there," Bedoni told a former colleague who had since left the department. "Whatever took those hours from us, it wasn't human and it wasn't something our training prepared us for." The canyon system where the incident occurred continues to be patrolled, though officers now travel in pairs and maintain strict communication protocols, a silent acknowledgement of the September night when time itself seemed to bend in the Arizona desert. It was early December of 2018 when Officer Emily Tsosi began her graveyard shift at the Navajo Nation Police Department's Chinle district. Winter had arrived early on the plateau, bringing with it freezing temperatures and occasional snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and unfamiliar. Tsosi, who had grown up in the nearby community of many farms, was familiar with winter driving conditions in the high desert, but even she found the roads particularly treacherous on this night. A light snow had fallen earlier in the day, melting slightly during the afternoon before refreezing as the temperature dropped, creating a thin layer of black ice that made navigation hazardous. Her patrol that evening would focus on the main highways, as the back roads were considered too dangerous for routine patrols in these conditions. At approximately 1:22 a.m., Sosi was driving south on Highway 191 when she noticed headlights approaching rapidly from behind. The vehicle appeared to be a large pickup truck, though its make and model were difficult to determine in the darkness and blowing snow. As it drew closer, she noted that it was traveling at an excessive speed for the road conditions, easily 80 miles per hour on a stretch where the posted limit was 65 and where even that would have been reckless given the ice. Sosi prepared to initiate a traffic stop, checking her speed and activating her recording equipment. As the truck passed her, she caught a brief glimpse of it through the swirling snow. An older model Ford, dark in color, with what appeared to be a rack of lights mounted above the cab. The vehicle swerved slightly as it passed, nearly losing control before correcting and continuing south at the same dangerous speed. Sosi immediately gave chase, activating her emergency lights and siren. The pursuit continued for approximately 7 miles, with the truck maintaining its speed despite the treacherous conditions. Sosi radioed dispatch to report the pursuit, providing the vehicle's description and direction of travel. The dispatcher acknowledged the call and advised that additional units were being dispatched to assist with a stop ahead. As they approached the turnoff for Canyon de Chelly, the truck suddenly brake-checked, forcing Sosi to swerve onto the shoulder to avoid a collision. When she regained control of her vehicle and looked up, the truck was nowhere to be seen. There were no turnoffs or side roads in the immediate area, and the terrain on either side of the highway consisted of steep embankments that would have made off-road travel impossible. Assuming the truck had turned into the canyon entrance without signaling, Sosi proceeded cautiously to the overlook area, where she found the parking lot empty and covered with a fresh layer of undisturbed snow. There were no tire tracks other than her own, and no indication that any vehicle had recently entered or exited the area. Confused, she returned to the highway, scanning in both directions with her spotlight. The road was empty in both directions, with no visible taillights or headlights. When she contacted dispatch to report that the vehicle had apparently vanished, she learned something unsettling. No other units had been able to locate the truck, and more disturbingly, no other officers had observed it, despite several being positioned along the route it would have taken. The following morning, Sosi returned to the area with her sergeant to search for any evidence that might explain the disappearance. They found no tire tracks, no signs of an accident, and no indication that any vehicle other than Sosi's patrol car had been on that stretch of highway during the night. The dashcam footage from the pursuit was reviewed, but it revealed only the vague shape of the truck disappearing into the snow and darkness. No clear license plate, no distinguishing features beyond what Sosi had already described. What was particularly strange was that the audio recording captured the sound of the truck's engine as it passed, but the sound seemed to fade unnaturally quickly, as if the vehicle had been moving away at an impossible speed. The incident report, filed as case number 18-12073, documents the pursuit and subsequent disappearance of the vehicle. It includes a note from the supervising officer indicating that similar reports had been made over the years, specifically of a dark pickup truck that would appear suddenly, drive at reckless speeds, and then vanish without explanation. The most recent prior report had been filed 2 years earlier by an officer who had since retired from the department. In that incident, the phantom truck had been observed on the same stretch of highway during a snowstorm, under remarkably similar circumstances. Sosi never saw the truck again during her remaining years with the department, but the experience left her with a newfound respect for the mysteries that the Arizona desert holds. Mysteries that sometimes manifest as phantom vehicles on frozen highways, appearing suddenly from the darkness and disappearing just as mysteriously, leaving behind only questions and the memory of headlights cutting through the snow. It was late January of 2019 when the Navajo Nation Police Department opened a new substation in the remote community of Navajo Mountain, an isolated area near the Arizona-Utah border that had previously been served only by periodic patrols. The facility was modest, a small modular building with 2 holding cells, a dispatch center, and enough office space for 4 officers to work rotating shifts. Officer Raymond Benally was among the first to be assigned to the new substation, bringing with him 15 years of experience with the tribal police. The location was strategically chosen to provide law enforcement presence in an area that had previously been underserved, but its isolation presented unique challenges. The nearest backup was over an hour away, and communication systems were unreliable at best. The first few weeks of operation passed without incident, as Benally and his colleagues settled into a routine that emphasized community engagement over enforcement. The building, though new, had an unusual history. It had been constructed on the site of a former trading post that had burned down under mysterious circumstances in the early 1970s. Local residents had advised against placing the substation there, citing traditional beliefs about the area being a place where the veil between worlds is thin, but these concerns had been dismissed as superstition by the department's administration. It wasn't until early February that the first unusual occurrences began, flickering lights that couldn't be attributed to electrical problems, doors that would open and close on their own, and the distinct feeling of being watched when the building was empty. The first direct sighting occurred on February 12th, when Benally was working the night shift alone. At approximately 3:17 a.m., as he was completing paperwork at his desk, he detected movement in his peripheral vision. When he looked up, he saw what appeared to be a human-shaped shadow moving along the far wall of the dispatch center. The figure was darker than the natural shadows cast by the emergency lighting, and it moved with a fluidity that seemed unnatural. Benally drew his sidearm and announced his presence, but the figure continued its slow, deliberate movement along the wall before disappearing into a corner where no physical obstruction existed. A thorough search of the building revealed no signs of intrusion, and all doors and windows remained secured from the inside. 2 weeks later, Officer Charlene James experienced a similar sighting while on duty. At approximately 2:45 a.m., she observed what appeared to be multiple shadow figures moving through the hallway outside the dispatch center. Unlike the previous sighting, these figures were more numerous, at least 3 or 4 distinct shapes that moved independently of one another. James reported that they seemed to be aware of her observation, pausing momentarily before retreating into the darkness of the empty offices. When she investigated, she found nothing unusual, but noted that the temperature in the hallway had dropped significantly despite the building's heating system functioning normally. The security cameras, which covered all areas of the substation, had mysteriously malfunctioned during the time of the sighting, recording only static. The most disturbing incident occurred on March 3rd, when both Benally and James were working together overnight. At approximately 1:22 a.m., the building's security system indicated that the rear door had been opened, despite being electronically locked and monitored. When the officers investigated, they found the door still secured, with no signs of forced entry. As they were returning to the dispatch center, both simultaneously observed a tall, thin shadow figure standing in the corridor ahead of them. This sighting was different from the previous ones. The figure appeared more substantial, with discernible features that were vaguely human but somehow wrong, as if viewed through a distorted lens. It turned toward them, and though it had no face that they could distinguish, both officers experienced an overwhelming sense of malevolence that caused them to retreat to the secure dispatch area. The following day, a traditional ceremony was performed at the substation by a local medicine man, who explained that the area was known to be a gathering place for shadow spirits, entities that existed between the physical and spiritual worlds. He advised that the building itself was not the issue, but rather the location upon which it stood. The department administration, initially skeptical of the officers' reports, became more concerned when multiple officers independently described similar experiences. The decision was eventually made to relocate the substation to a different site, though this process would take nearly a year to complete. In the meantime, officers were required to work in pairs, and many refused to take night shifts at the location. The official incident reports, filed under case numbers 19-02-084, 19-02-091, and 19-03-017, document the unexplained phenomena but offer no conventional explanation. The substation was eventually demolished and rebuilt at a new location approximately 2 miles away, where no similar incidents have been reported. The original site remains vacant, a silent testament to the belief held by many in the community that there are places where the physical world intersects with something else, something that manifests as shadows that move with purpose and intelligence in the darkness of the Arizona night. It was early April of 2020 when Officer Nathan Lee was assigned to the Navajo Nation Police Department's Dilkin district. The COVID-19 pandemic had brought unprecedented challenges to law enforcement across the country, and the Navajo Nation was particularly hard hit, with infection rates among the highest in the United States. Lee, who had recently completed his training at the Federal Law Enforcement Academy, was assigned to assist with checkpoint operations and community education efforts. His background in forensic anthropology made him particularly valuable for investigations requiring specialized knowledge of evidence collection and preservation, skills that would soon be put to the test in a case that defied conventional explanation. On April 17th, Lee was dispatched to a remote area south of Dilkin, where a rancher had reported unusual tracks on his property. The caller, 68-year-old Herbert Wilson, described finding a series of footprints that began abruptly in the middle of his pasture and ended just as mysteriously approximately 200 yards away. When Lee arrived at the scene, he found Wilson waiting beside his truck, looking uneasy despite his many years of experience in the area. "I've seen all kinds of animal tracks out here," Wilson explained, "but I've never seen anything like these. They just start, right there in the middle of the field, with nothing leading up to them, and they end the same way." The rancher pointed toward a series of impressions in the sandy soil, each approximately 14 inches in length and 6 inches wide, with a stride distance of over 6 feet. Lee began documenting the tracks with photographs and measurements, noting their unusual characteristics. The prints showed a distinct 3-toed pattern with a heel impression that was deeper than the rest of the foot, suggesting a creature of considerable weight. What was most puzzling was the fact that the tracks began suddenly, as if whatever had made them had materialized out of thin air. There was no disturbance in the vegetation leading up to the first print, no evidence of approach from any direction. Lee followed the track line for approximately 200 yards, finding that it ended just as abruptly as it had begun. The final print was followed by undisturbed soil in all directions, with no indication of where the creature had gone. As Lee was completing his documentation, he noticed something else unusual, a series of circular formations in the grass approximately 50 yards from where the tracks ended. Each formation was approximately 10 feet in diameter, with the grass within the circle compressed in a clockwise spiral pattern. There were 5 such formations arranged in a pentagonal pattern, with the track line ending at the center of this arrangement. The grass showed signs of exposure to intense heat, with some areas showing charring at the base of the blades, though there was no evidence of fire elsewhere in the vicinity. Lee collected soil and grass samples for analysis, noting that the temperature in the immediate area of the formations was noticeably higher than the surrounding ground. The following day, Lee returned to the site with additional officers to conduct a more thorough search of the area. They discovered additional track lines approximately half a mile to the east, these with the same unusual characteristics, beginning and ending abruptly with no approach or departure evidence. What was particularly strange was that these new tracks followed a different pattern, moving in a circular formation before ending at another series of heat-affected grass rings. The officers also found several small, smooth stones arranged in geometric patterns that didn't appear to be natural formations. When one of the officers attempted to collect one of these stones, he reported that it was unusually warm to the touch, despite the cool morning air. The evidence collected from the site was sent to a forensic laboratory for analysis. The results, when they came back several weeks later, only deepened the mystery. The soil samples from the tracks contained trace elements that were not consistent with the local geology. Specifically, higher concentrations of aluminum and titanium compounds. The grass samples from the circular formations showed evidence of exposure to microwave radiation, though there were no known sources of such radiation in the area. The smooth stones were found to be composed of a common type of sandstone, but surface analysis revealed microscopic patterns that suggested artificial shaping rather than natural weathering. The official incident report, filed as case number 20E04112, documents these findings but offers no conventional explanation for the phenomena. In the months that followed, several other residents in the Dilken area reported similar findings: mysterious tracks that began and ended abruptly, circular formations in vegetation, and unusual arrangements of stones. The Navajo Nation Police Department never officially connected these incidents, but officers who worked in the area were aware of the pattern. Lee, who had a scientific background, struggled to find a rational explanation for what he had witnessed. Every rule of evidence collection and analysis we were taught in the academy, none of it applied to this case, he later told a colleague. It was as if we were documenting something that operated according to a different set of physical laws. The case remains officially unsolved, with the evidence still stored in the department's cold case facility. The pasture where the initial tracks were found has since been fenced off by the rancher, who avoids the area and refuses to discuss what he witnessed there in the spring of 2020. A silent acknowledgement that there are phenomena in the Arizona desert that defy explanation, leaving behind only tracks that lead nowhere and questions that have no answers. It was late May of 2021 when officers Jessica Tso and Samuel Key were assigned to a special detail in the remote western portion of the Navajo Nation, an area known as the Devil's Zone by local residents due to its history of unusual phenomena. The assignment was temporary, a 3-week detail to provide additional patrol coverage while the district underwent staffing transitions. Both officers were experienced and professional, with little patience for what they considered superstition or folklore. Tso had a degree in criminal justice from Northern Arizona University, while Key had previously worked as a park ranger before joining the tribal police. Neither was inclined to believe in the supernatural explanations that some local residents offered for the strange occurrences reported in the area over the years. The first week of their assignment passed without incident, as the officers settled into a routine that emphasized visibility and community engagement. They patrolled the main roads during daylight hours and established a presence at the community center in the small town of Cactus Valley, which served as their base of operations. The area was indeed remote, a landscape of mesas, canyons, and open desert that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Cell service was virtually non-existent, and radio communications were unreliable, requiring the officers to rely on satellite phones for most of their correspondence with the district headquarters. It was this isolation, they would later realize, that made the area particularly conducive to the experiences they were about to have. The first unusual incident occurred on the evening of May 18th as Tso and Key were patrolling a dirt road that led to the base of a prominent mesa known locally as Echo Rock. At approximately 9:47 p.m., as they stopped to check a map, both officers simultaneously heard what sounded like voices coming from the direction of the mesa. The voices were faint and indistinct, speaking in what sounded like Navajo, but with an unusual cadence that neither officer could quite identify. When they drove closer to the mesa, the voices became clearer, though still not entirely comprehensible. What was particularly strange was that the sound seemed to move with them. No matter where they positioned themselves, the voices appeared to be coming from a different direction, as if the source was constantly shifting position. The following night, the officers returned to the same area with recording equipment, hoping to capture the phenomenon for documentation. At approximately 10:15 p.m., the voices began again, this time more clearly than before. What they recorded was unsettling. Multiple voices speaking in what a linguist would later identify as an archaic form of Navajo that hadn't been commonly used for generations. The content of the speech was fragmented, but seemed to involve warnings about those who walk between worlds, and references to the thin places where the veil is torn. The recording also captured something else, a low, resonant hum that seemed to underlie the voices, a frequency that both officers could feel in their chests as much as they could hear with their ears. The most disturbing incident occurred on May 22nd, when the officers were joined by Sergeant Mary Benally, who had driven out from district headquarters to check on their progress. At approximately 11:30 p.m., as the three were standing near the base of the mesa, they witnessed what appeared to be a series of lights moving along the upper ridge of the formation. The lights were not the steady beams of flashlights or the erratic movement of vehicles, but rather glowing orbs that moved with a smooth, deliberate quality that seemed to defy gravity. As they watched, one of the lights detached from the others and descended slowly toward the canyon floor, stopping approximately 50 yards from where the officers were standing. The light pulsed with a rhythmic quality that seemed to correspond to the low hum they had recorded the previous night. What happened next defied easy explanation. As the three officers watched, the light seemed to expand and contract, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape before collapsing back into a point of light. At the same moment, all three experienced a shared auditory hallucination, a clear voice speaking directly into their minds, saying in perfect English, "You should not be here." The experience was so startling and so synchronized that it could not be dismissed as individual imagination or suggestion. When they reported the incident to district headquarters, they were met with understandable skepticism, though their commanding officer, who had worked in the area for years, listened with unusual attentiveness. The official incident report, filed as case number 21-05089, documents the visual and auditory phenomena experienced by the three officers. The report includes the audio recording of the voices, though analysis by a Navajo linguist could only determine that the language was indeed a form of Diné, but too archaic and fragmented to translate with certainty. The report also notes the unusual physical sensations experienced by the officers. The resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through their bodies, the sudden temperature drops that accompanied the manifestations, and the shared mental communication that occurred during the final encounter. All three officers underwent psychological evaluation following the incident, with all being cleared for duty, but noting that the experience had profoundly affected their understanding of reality. In the weeks that followed, Tso and Ki completed their assignment and returned to their regular districts, though neither would ever speak publicly about what they had experienced in the Devil's Zone. Benally, who had more years of service and a deeper connection to traditional Navajo beliefs, later told a colleague that she believed the officers had encountered the holy people, spiritual beings from Navajo tradition who occupy the space between the physical and spiritual worlds. "There are places where the worlds touch," she explained, "and Echo Rock is one of them. What we experienced there wasn't good or evil. It was simply something beyond our understanding, something that reminds us that there are mysteries in this world that science cannot explain." The mesa continues to stand silent against the Arizona sky, its secrets held within the ancient stone, waiting for the next visitors who might be privileged, or unfortunate, enough to hear its voices in the desert night. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, particularly within the boundaries of the Navajo Nation, where ancient traditions intersect with modern law enforcement in ways that challenge our understanding of reality. The 7 cases we've explored tonight represent only a fraction of the unusual encounters documented by Navajo tribal police officers over the years. Encounters that suggest there are phenomena at work in the Arizona desert that defy conventional explanation. From the vanishing hitchhiker of Highway 160 to the mysterious tracks that lead nowhere, from phantom vehicles on frozen highways to shadow figures that move with purpose in abandoned buildings, these accounts share a common thread. They are documented by trained observers whose job is to note facts, not to entertain fantasies. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of a landscape that holds mysteries as deep as its canyons and as ancient as its mesas. The Navajo people have long understood that there are places where the veil between worlds is thin, places where entities can move between the physical and spiritual realms, leaving behind evidence that confounds scientific analysis. For tribal police officers, who must operate in the space between traditional beliefs and modern law enforcement, These encounters present unique challenges that their training never prepared them for. How does one file an incident report on a being that can walk through walls? How does one investigate a disappearance that leaves no physical evidence? How does one maintain professional composure when confronted with phenomena that defy the laws of physics as we understand them? The silence that follows these encounters is perhaps as telling as the events themselves. Many officers choose not to speak publicly about what they've witnessed, not out of fear of ridicule, but out of respect for forces they don't fully comprehend. In a culture that understands the power of words and the importance of not drawing unwanted attention, discretion becomes a form of protection. The official reports, when they exist at all, often use careful clinical language that hints at much more than they explicitly state: unidentified footprints, unexplained auditory phenomena, visual sighting of unknown bipedal entity. Behind these sterile phrases lie experiences that continue to haunt those who lived through them, experiences that reshape their understanding of the world and their place within it. What connects these disparate encounters is not just their geographic location, but their resistance to explanation. Each case presents evidence that points to something beyond our current understanding. Tracks that begin and end abruptly, vehicles that vanish without trace, voices that speak languages no longer commonly used, figures that move through physical barriers. These are not ghost stories told around campfires, but documented events experienced by multiple witnesses, often trained professionals whose job is to observe and report accurately. The consistency of these accounts across decades and among different officers suggests that there are indeed phenomena at work in the Arizona desert that operate according to principles we have yet to discover. The Navajo concept of hoju, balance and harmony with the natural and spiritual worlds, offers a framework for understanding these encounters that Western science cannot provide. Perhaps what these officers are experiencing is not supernatural in the sense of being contrary to nature, but rather natural in a way that our limited perspective cannot yet comprehend. The desert landscape, with its extreme conditions and ancient history, may harbor realities that remain hidden to those who approach it with assumptions based on urban experience and conventional physics. For those who live and work in this environment, the boundary between the known and unknown is more permeable, the distinction between physical and spiritual less sharply defined. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. The documentation of these experiences serves not only to satisfy curiosity, but to build a record that might eventually lead to greater understanding. Each account, each detail, each carefully documented observation adds to a body of evidence that suggests our world is more complex and mysterious than we generally acknowledge. The Navajo Nation police officers who have witnessed these phenomena continue their duties with professionalism and dedication, carrying with them the knowledge that there are aspects of their job that cannot be explained in training manuals or procedural guidelines. They serve in a landscape where the past and present intersect, where the physical and spiritual coexist,